Hey, Daniel, welcome to the Sisterhood.
Uh, Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here and glad to be part of this conversation.
So, tell us a little bit about who you are, just, who you live with, where you live, what you do on a regular basis.
Yeah, so Dan Darling, I'm a writer and a pastor. I'm an associate pastor here of a church in near Nashville, where we live. I also am a senior VP at the NRB, which is the Association of Christian Communicators. I worked for about 6.5 years at the ERLC, which is a public policy agency that's connected with the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. Um, and I'm married to Angela. We've been married for uh, almost 18 years, and we have four beautiful children. My oldest is 15, and she's about ready to start driving. And then I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old. So it's a pretty full house, especially right now as we're doing the whole back to school thing. We live in the Nashville area. We love Tennessee. I'm originally from Chicago. A huge Cubs fan, Bulls fan, Bears fan. My wife is from Texas. So in Nashville, we're kind of in the middle. Works pretty well.
Yeah, so great. Such a fun place to live.
Yeah. And I
Yes.
have a 15-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Look at
Yeah.
that.
I
Yeah.
know. I also
So it's a
haven't.
full house.
Yeah.
So like
um,
last night I had to run out twice because my son had school today. First I had to run out to get a flash drive because we ordered one on Amazon, but it came late, but he had to have a flash drive to give a file to his teacher. So I'm at Walgreens looking for a flash drive. Thankfully they have them. And then I had to run back up because, oh wait, we need a scientific calculator. So I was
Right.
looking for a scientific calculator.
do they have those at Walgreens?
No, I had to go to Walmart. I had to step it up a little bit, and I
Yeah.
got
Mhm.
one. So good
Good
times.
Great.
job.
Nice. Way to go, Dad. Way to
Yeah.
go.
Well,
Well,
can I just throw in that you worked at the ERLC? So you worked with Russell Moore,
Hmm.
Dr. Moore.
I did work with Dr. Moore for about 6.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. He's my hero. I just really think so much of him. I think as we're going into this conversation about social media and how we have good conversations, I think he manages this speaking truth and hope well in the online space. So I very much appreciate him. And I'm just glad to have you on. I told you before we started recording that I follow you on Twitter. So I can attest to you being a positive voice out in the world. We're talking today about speaking hope and love in this online space. So just if our listeners don't follow you already, I'm going to tell them to go to Twitter and follow you there.
All right. At Dan Darling is where I am on Twitter. So I'm apologizing ahead of time for I tweet a lot sometimes when there's a lot of sports, particularly the Chicago Cubs or NBA playoffs right now. So apologizing ahead of time for that.
Well, so let's jump into our topic today. We're talking about hard conversations and specifically in the online space or the digital space. Actually, it could be, really in any avenue that we're using screens for communication. But where I want to start is with this idea of wisdom. Can you talk a little bit about the role that wisdom plays as we're communicating with others?
I think that's a great question. I think wisdom plays a couple of roles. I think, first of all, it's really important now, perhaps more than any other time, to separate, wisdom from knowledge. I think humans generally, we are wired with a kind of insatiable curiosity to know things. I think this is good. This is part of what it means to be an image bearer, to be made in the image of God. Uh, we have a whole book of the Bible that really tells us to pursue wisdom and knowledge. This is good. Uh, Wisdom, knowledge is obviously the accumulation of, facts and information. Um, Whereas wisdom is kind of in my view, the kind of the, knowing how to use that information or when to use that. I think in a digital age, it's really important because there's a kind of pursuit of knowledge and wisdom that is like I said, we have this insatiable curiosity. We want to learn about God's world. It's actually an act of humility, right? Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, you know, we're acknowledging that we're not God, that we need to learn things. We're not all knowing. There's another way to kind of seek after information that I don't think is healthy that the digital world can sometimes foster, where it's this kind of just endless, accumulation of shallow information, tidbits of information, um, the kind of bombardment with news, and I actually think Jen Michelle, who wrote a great book on paradoxes, she has a quote in there, and she talks about how it goes back to the Garden of Eden, where where Satan tempted Eve with this idea that we could be all knowing. And one of the real temptations of the digital age, having this phone in my pocket with Google on there, is this idea that I can just be all knowing. Like, this is what fuels kind of the FOMO idea that I can't miss out. Like, the reason we're reaching for our phones and shaking, after like 10 minutes is because we're worried we're going to miss out on something. We're worried we're not going to be in the know. We're worried that we won't be in control. But the thing is, humans were not designed to be all knowing. We're designed to live in mystery, and we're designed to acknowledge the sovereignty of a God who is all knowing. So I think that we have to separate kind of the pursuit of knowledge and the curiosity that is good, and like the kind of junk food information that doesn't feed our souls and actually is corrosive. Nicholas Carr talks about this in his book, The Shallows. I don't know if he's a believer or not, but he talks about kind of skimming versus, deep accumulation of information. And look, we all battle it. We all lose hours just kind of scrolling Facebook, scrolling Twitter. But the other thing about wisdom is that knowing when to speak and how to speak and what to speak on and what I should be sharing. Do I have all the information? Do I know the whole story? Am I the right person to say something? All those questions involve wisdom, I think, too. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but
No, it's so good. And I really see it as two parts. So you've got the consumption part, and then you've got the output. So I guess input, output, maybe let's put it in
Yeah,
those terms.
that's
So
good.
the input part of what am I consuming, and then what am I giving? So I want to go back to the input a little bit and ask you about this idea of what we're consuming. How do we get away from fake news? And, there is no, there isn't news without bias. There isn't. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the reality is that we live, whatever channel you choose to turn on, you're going to get a certain slant. And also, we're in a pandemic where people are wanting that constant information of what's going on, and are there any advancements today, and what's happening in these states and around the country or around the world if someone's listening in another country. So just talk to us a little bit about how we responsibly stay informed, but yet use that wisdom filter as we're consuming.
That's really hard and difficult because the news, there's a good and bad. Um, it's good and bad that the news is so deregulated, right? In the old days, and I'm only 42, so I can't really say that, but um, I do remember as a kid, we got 3 newspapers every day in Chicago, and then we didn't have a TV, but my grandparents did. You have the kind of 3 or 4 channels on TV for news, and then you had radio. You kind of trusted, there was one source. We all listened to the same source. Now, part of the reason that we have such a deregulation is perhaps those sources weren't showing all the perspectives and were, lean one way or the other. So in some ways it's good because there are stories that get told that may not have gotten told. On the other hand, we now are kind of in our tribes and our echo chambers where we only receive news from sources that confirm our bias. It's what people call confirmation bias. And this happens on both sides of the spectrum. So this happens if you're on the right, you tend to get right-leaning news. If you're on the left, you may get left-leaning news. You also may kind of just tend to trust the so-called mainstream outlets, but all of them have a bias, right? And all of them, have a narrative that they're trying to show. What I really lament is the absence of kind of just reporting what's happening instead of, and now it's just kind of, there's this narrative. But I do think we just have to read from a variety of sources. I think we just need to, particularly when it's a story that seems kind of sensational or a little bit alarming and fearful, wait a little bit, read a few other things. Is this correct? I have found also through the pandemic that local news has been really helpful, right? Because a local news station is not as incentivized, I don't think, like the national ones are, although there's some really good coverage in the national. But I just think we have to be wise about that. We have to read from a variety of sources, wait before we form opinions, think about how much misinformation flies. And we have to be careful as Christians that we don't share things that may not be true. And it's so easy to do, is it not? I mean, I think of a few examples in the last few years. This kid at the March for Life a couple of years ago,
that is exactly
came out that was kind of half. You saw half the video. Everybody jumped on it. News organizations jumped on it. It confirmed a narrative that these pro-lifers are a certain way. It comes out that wasn't actually the story, but you already had op-eds and newspapers talking, analyzing his smirk and all this stuff. Well, it turned out not to be true. Or you see things on the other side where there's conspiracy theories about, whatever going on the left or the right. I think you're seeing a little bit right now with the pandemic, with all this kind of things floating around. So I just think we have to be wise and just be slow to just believe things, particularly if it confirms our biases. Like if it makes our side look good and it makes the other side look terrible, let's just wait a little bit, right? Is this the whole story? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That was the exact example I was thinking of. That story of that young man in DC with the Make America Great Again hat on. It just was a visual that people globbed onto, me included. I believed the narrative based on the part of the video that I saw.
And look, we want it to be true. There's a part of us that wants it to be true because it confirms what we already think about that person or that organization. There was a conspiracy theory, I'll use one on the left, about Hillary Clinton and this like
pizza place,
sex trafficking ring and a pizza place, and some guy believed it so much he actually went in and almost killed people. Fortunately, he was stopped. Again, it confirmed our bias, and I think we just have to say, is this really true? Like, I want it to be true, but is it true? Christians should pursue the truth. We should be people known for that.
So we have a friend who shared something, I'd say at the beginning of this summer, that had to do with the pandemic. And then the next day, she posted an apology on Facebook and said, it was pointed out to me that this was not true. And she had some really great points about, as a believer, she wants to be someone who promotes what is true in the world and feels like we have a responsibility to do our research. And even though we may be sharing about a topic that's not related to the gospel, it gives an impression of our credibility if we are sharing things that are untrue in other areas of our lives. If when it's time to speak about God's hope in the world and his grace, we've lost credibility because we are sharing things that are untrue. Would you agree that that is something that we need to keep in mind as we're sharing about whatever on social media, that our credibility may be at stake and that we don't want to lose it because of things that really do matter to us?
I agree with that. I think the credibility is at stake. I mean, um, first of all, we should always share what's true, because as a Christian, we care about the truth, right? And I think what she did was right. I mean, look, all of us are going to make mistakes. We're gonna pass stuff along that, oh, you know what? I found out this wasn't true. I think her correcting herself publicly was really great, and a good example, a good model. I think uh, we also have to ask ourselves too. Okay, is this a story or a controversy that really, like, should I be weighing in on this? So here's this controversy happening over there. It's important, but do I have to say anything about it? Right? Like, this is part of just having wisdom in terms of consumption. It's okay if there's a political controversy or a Christian Twitter controversy that I don't know much about, and I don't know what's going on with that. I'm not weighing in. I don't think we have to weigh in on everything all the time. Just say, sometimes we should. Like, I'm not against having these conversations online. I think we should have robust conversations. We should have disagreements, but I think we can do it in a way that is distinctly Christian, right? That God cares not just that we're on the right side, but he also cares about the words we use when we're talking about these things.
Yeah, it takes so much discernment. Alex and I actually were talking about that in an episode we had called Stewarding Your Voice, and about, am I the one to speak on this? Even though this is like a central issue that people are talking about, is my voice important in this conversation or not? And it takes a lot of discernment to know whether you should be speaking into that or not. Okay, so I want to give you a scenario. So I feel like Facebook and Twitter tend to be more of the places where people are talking about issues that are controversial, that those just tend to be the places, I feel like, as opposed to Instagram or Snapchat, which doesn't really. So let's say someone posts something and you're feeling, you have that sense of, I can't just let this go. Like, this is really bothering me. I really don't agree with what this person is posting. I don't agree with this source. What do you do? And how do you go about engaging in that conversation, in that hard conversation where you really don't think the same as that person and it's going to be hard?
Yeah, I think we have to ask ourselves, first of all, is this going to be a fruitful conversation? Can I help advance the conversation? Sometimes we can. Like, I sometimes I'll do this on Facebook. I think we have to, when we do this, we have to kind of remember when we do it. Okay, I'm not just arguing with avatars and pixels. This is a person made in the image of God. They may be wrong here, but they're not the sum total of their arguments, right? They're a whole person. And so, can I weigh in a way that still sees their humanity? So can I say, hey, that's interesting. Have you considered this? Or here's a link that I read, or here's something that I read. And can you have a conversation going back and forth with somebody where you're disagreeing? One of the things I try to do in these interactions, when I feel like, I'm going to weigh in here, it's interesting. I found a lot of times where I weighed in and it wasn't fruitful, and it's like, oh, why did I waste my time with this? Other times I found people saying, thank you for that. Even the person that posted it, I haven't seen that, or I haven't considered that, or I'm going to go read that. But what I try to do is always keep it in a good faith argument. So yeah, you're going back and forth, and I always try to end well, like something like, man, thank you for engaging here. This has been a good conversation. You raised some good points. You know what I mean? Just to keep that going. Now, there are going to be people that are never going to argue in good faith, right? We're in a fallen world, and there are trolls out there that are just not worth engaging. They're never going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're always going to think the worst about people. It's just not worth doing that, because they're not going to change, and they pull you down with them. But for a lot of people in the middle, and ordinary people, sometimes you just have to say, is this worth engaging? Is this issue that important? Is this and sometimes we don't get it right. Sometimes I find myself engaging in a conversation. I'm like, does this really matter? So I think we just have to ask ourselves. It's not always wrong, though. And this is where people are having their conversations. And this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is that I'm not advocating that we go back to the 1950s, because we're not. We're not going to all suddenly become Amish. Like the internet's here to stay. Social media is not going anywhere. So how do we steward this well? How do we use our voices well? And I think we need to have conversations. Sometimes you can go into a Facebook post and maybe bring some new information or correct the record in a way that educates people and maybe changes people's minds or stops kind of the spread of, misinformation. The other thing sometimes you can do is you can talk privately to that person. So you think, man, this is real heated. I've sent messages and people sent messages to me and say, I read what you wrote. I hear what you're saying. Here's some other things I said, or have you considered this? And that can be helpful too, because it takes, when you're having a conversation on Twitter or Facebook, you're doing it in public. And that's one thing we forget, is that we're having it in public. So yeah, I'm arguing with someone on Facebook, but it's like if we were, on stage and people were there watching. So how would I argue with someone on stage if people were watching? I probably wouldn't be as direct and pointed and crass as sometimes we are when we think, well, I'm behind the screen and it's comfortable. So.
Yeah, I will say our friend, going back to the story I told about how she came back the next day and said, I'm sorry, I realized that this story I shared was not true and could be harmful. In some of her points that she laid out, she said, part of why I was able to see this was because my friends came to me privately and with humility pointed out some things. And because of their gentle nature and the private approach, I was able to receive that and hear that. And I think we forget that we have that option when we're in the middle of a Facebook thread and the conversation is going, and we want people to see our great points, and we want to be the hero that points out how the holes are exposed in this person's argument. We forget that we have the option of having that private conversation. So I think that's a good reminder. But can you speak to doing that heart check of motive? I find in that example that Krista gave, when I read something and it just doesn't sit well with me and I feel like, I have to say something, it's healthy for me and better for me if I sit for a minute before I respond and ask myself, what's my motive in responding and in responding this way? Because sometimes it's because I'm defensive, because they're arguing against everything I believe to be true, and I want to point out how they're wrong, and I want to be right. So how do we manage those feelings that are happening, and use them to our advantage so that we can speak with words that show grace and dignity to the other person?
That's such a great point. We really need to ask ourselves, what is my motive here? Because, adrenaline kicks in. There's a kind of a dopamine hit. And as someone who loves to I like to have robust discussions. I have friends across the political, I'm pretty conservative politically, but I have friends, I'll just say I have dear friends who are godly people, who are godlier than me, who think the president is like one of the greatest ever. And I go round and round with them, and I agree with them on some points, and I disagree on some points. But I still love them. We're friends. And I have other friends who think, it is the worst thing that's happened in the United States. And I go round and round with them, and I disagree at some points and agree at some points. But I like having those robust discussions. So I, naturally like the debate, but you kind of get a dopamine hit, like I'm right? That kind of feeling. And I do think we do need to slow down when James says slow to speak, slow to wrath, because our tendency is, and ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why am I responding here? Like, what's my motive here in doing this? And I also just think, how would I want to be treated if it was me? There's such a temptation in the digital age, because we're in public, to show everyone else that we're right. Like, I want everyone to know that I'm on the right side, just so everybody knows, here's all the wrong people, here's all the right people, I'm on the right side. Twitter especially. I mean, there's a perverse incentive for Christians to be like the Pharisee in the temple, that Jesus pointed out, and just to say, I thank God I'm not like those other terrible Christians. I mean, there's just an incentive. So I do think when we see something, what's our motive, number one? And our motive will determine how we respond, because if our motive is to be right or to show people that we're on the right side, then we'll resort to kind of like public, like, can you believe these people? Or, of course you'd say that because you're here, or this is what passes for whatever. Versus
the tone is biting. The tone feels biting in that.
We want to embarrass them. I mean, there's a perverse incentive to embarrass people. I mean, like, I get up every day thinking, who is the internet going to crush today? Who's going to be the ritual sacrifice? Who's going to be the scapegoat where we put all our guilt on? And so I think instead of that, just responding and saying, have you considered this? Have you thought of this? Or, I don't know if I quite agree with you. Can we talk about this? Where you could still have a conversation, but we have to look at our motives. And one of the things I do talk about a lot is, I'm not just saying let's be nice online, which we should be, but I'm saying let's ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing, right? And, these online conversations are public. We're in a position now that I don't think humanity's ever been in, where everybody has a stage. You've always had prominent people with big followings throughout history, but everybody has a stage, and we're on stage all the time. And I don't know that we're made for that. And so the temptation is to curate a version of ourselves online that kind of completes what we feel is lacking in our real lives. Right. So I find sometimes some of the most pugilistic, nasty people online, if I've met a few, they're like so meek and quiet in their real lives. And I don't know if there's a thing of like, they've never been the fighter, so now they can curate a version of themselves of fighting, or someone who, you can create a victim story. I mean, there are a lot of victims that have shared their stories bravely, but you can create a story, a victim narrative, or you can, create the image on Instagram of being this super dad or super mom, or an activist of I'm on the right side of all these things. And I think the temptation is to curate a version of ourselves that we feel is lacking. And the Christian gospel has an answer for that. It says that God loves the real version of me. He likes the real me. He died for the real me. And I don't have to curate what I think is a perfect version of me to gain affirmation from a particular tribe or crowd, because I'm known by God and I know God. And so I think once we're free of that, we can use these tools in a way that glorifies God. But we have to just watch out for those temptations that, am I doing this because I really care about this, or am I doing it because I'm, to quote one of my friends, that I'm trying to be a thing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And thank you for saying that. I think it's the core reminder that we operate out of how God made us, and God didn't make us to be on stage all the time. And so again, that gets to our motive. What am I trying to fill by posting this here? And even if it's not in response, even if it's on Instagram, like you said, what am I trying to portray? And why is that important for me to post right now? And maybe it's not a big thing. Maybe it's just, I'm being silly and I want to show everybody the crazy hair day at school or whatever. It doesn't always have to be a big, deep thing, but sometimes it is. And we only know if we ask those questions of ourselves. So thank you for reminding us that God gives us the answer to those questions. We don't have to be wondering if we're enough, or we don't have to show off, because he sees it all, he knows it all, and he loves us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, that doesn't mean we don't do anything, right? Or we don't post anything, but just saying, why am I doing this? What's the point of this? Sometimes we do need to speak up on important issues and speak up. We can use our voice. I think it also helps us, knowing who we are in Christ helps us say, okay, God has given me this opportunity in this platform. So how can I use it to bring joy? How can I elevate other voices? How can I do all these things, right? I do talk a lot about leaders and platform. This is I feel like is a constant conversation among evangelicals and celebrity and all that. And I don't know that necessarily having a platform is bad. I think God sometimes will give people a calling that means that they have quite a few followers or people read their books or pastor, and it's not really new. I think we are in an age that kind of encourages people to kind of be famous for being famous, but platforms aren't new, right? I mean, Charles Spurgeon had a huge platform through his writings in his church, and you go back even through church history. Martin Luther did, Augustine did a certain way, just so the question is just how do I steward this well? How do I use this for the glory of God? How do I remind myself of who I really am in Christ? And I think knowing that helps us steward it well and kind of have the humility to say, I don't know everything, and I'm only going to comment and talk about things that really pertain to me. I also think that gives us a sense of accountability, right? Because James 3 talks about spiritual leaders and talks about the sober weight of that calling. And then it kind of goes into this long passage about the tongue and about our words can either bring life or death. And I think what he's saying there is if you are in some kind of leadership position, and if you're some kind of have a platform of some kind, to know that your words carry more weight. I really think Christian leaders need to understand that when they're using social media. We don't always realize we're in public. And leaders, what leaders do in excess, their followers will do, what leaders do in moderation, their followers will do in excess. Leaders give their followers a permission structure to do things. So if we are engaging in these kind of just like crass and nasty ways, if we're, sharing it, articles or information that's not true, then we're giving permission to those that follow us that, hey, this is the way to do it. And so people also look at leaders' words differently. So we have to be careful and wise about that. I'm not saying Christian leaders shouldn't be on social media. I actually think they should be, but they have to just know that you're not in some like vacuum here, right? It's as if you are in front of in the pulpit, or some leaders have 50,000, 100,000 followers. So imagine yourself in a stadium. Now ask yourself, would I say these things? Right. And I think that's kind of the questions we need to ask.
I kept thinking about Colossians 3 when you were talking, just, clothe yourself with compassion and kindness and gentleness. And, that we can engage. We don't have to not engage, but there is a way of wisdom in this. There is a way to engage that is important. And I think it encapsulates everything we've talked about. It encapsulates wisdom and leadership and all of that how we say things matters. It's not what we say half the time, it's how we're saying it and how we're approaching people, because like you said, these are real people, and we have to remember all the time that we are representing Christ in us, and spending that time, I think, as we are thinking about what to respond to or not, really taking that time of prayer and meditation and journaling or whatever we need to do to really think through, what are my thoughts on this? Where is God calling me to speak on this? And doing that pre-work before we just are jumping in feels helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one thing to consider, I think 1 Peter 3:15 is a great verse for this age, where he says, have an answer for every man or every person for the hope that lies within you. So be willing to engage these debates and have these arguments and talk about these things, but do it with gentleness and kindness. So Peter is saying that civility and courage go together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have this idea that they can't go together, that the only way to display courage is to be the loudest person in the room. The truth is sometimes the most courageous person is the one who's quiet. Jesus, before his accusers, was often quiet. On the other hand, we also have this mistaken idea that civility means never speaking up, never saying anything controversial. Look, the gospel is controversial. The true gospel is controversial. It always has been. It's always been countercultural. You're saying to the rulers of this world that there's another king and another kingdom, and they are not ultimate. When the gospel came into the Roman Empire, it was controversial. It was saying that guy Caesar there, he may have some power, but he's not ultimate, right? And so I think we just have to understand. We have to avoid the idea that in order to have courage, I have to always be stirring things up, and the nastier I am, the more courageous I am. This is actually, a sign of not of courage, but of weakness, right? Because if you understand and know what you believe, and that you believe that as a Christian that Christ has risen from the grave and he's defeated sin, death, and the grave, then we don't have to resort to these kind of tactics, right? And it's interesting to me that in all the qualifications for spiritual leadership in the New Testament, particularly in the epistles, you see every time gentleness.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're thinking about Christian leadership and what disqualifies someone, we often look at the moral questions, which we should, right? Are they faithful to their spouses and all that? We should also be asking those other questions Paul's saying. Are they gentle? Not a brawler, not quarrelsome, not engaging in petty arguments. So those are also, so you can be courageous and have all those characteristics. On the other hand, civility doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean not speaking out on important issues, right? Paul, who's counseling us toward gentleness, and Peter, who's counseling us toward gentleness, they also spoke up. They lost their lives for the gospel. So so there's a certain point we have to come to reckon with ourselves that we can be incredibly kind and gentle as we should be, and we can be civil, and yet what we're saying, if we're representing Christ, is still going to cut hard, right? Jesus did this perfectly, and they killed him, right? And so I think we need to see that both of these things go together. And Peter talks about that. He says, you're going to suffer as a Christian. Things are going to be controversial, countercultural. Make sure that your suffering is not because you're sinning, because you're uncivil or being a jerk, right? That's my translation. So does that make sense? So I think we have to hold these two things in tension. We need to speak up, but we need to do it with civility.
No, I love it so much. I mean, it's true. Like that resonates so deeply with me because it's true. Those things can hold hands, and that it's actually really important that they do. And the more that we can lean into wisdom, the more we will be able to hold that tension well. I believe that wisdom is the key to holding that tension.
Yeah, it really is. And I think having a disposition of seeing the other person as a human being, also have a disposition of humility. One of the things that can come with, especially when you're doing apologetics or you're doing activism or you're defending the truth, which we should, right? I mean, Paul told Timothy to stand firm, and Jude says we should defend the truth once delivered to the saints. There can come an arrogance with that.
Yeah.
And that I'm right. And it feels good. And I think we need humility to say, I may not be right about everything, right? I especially on most of our disputes with other Christians or just online are not, some of them are around important things about which we must not budge, but a lot of them are about secondary and tertiary things where I have a strong opinion, you have a strong opinion, I may be wrong about this. And can I live with people who disagree with me? Can I tolerate people who disagree with me? Can I be friends with people? Look, we're in an election season right now, and Christians need to practice this more than anybody. People are going to land at different places.
Yeah.
People are going to land here. They're going to land here with their vote. Choosing who to vote for, what to vote for is hard and difficult. And so can we say, I land here, you land here. I see your reasons for landing there. Here's my reasons. I'm going to love you. We're still going to be friends. And I'm not going to judge you for that. I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm not going to judge you for that, right? And I think it's really important for us to have opinions, but to hold them loosely, right? And to say, I could be wrong about this. I mean, I think differently about things now than I did 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
For sure.
And if we can't live alongside people with whom we disagree, we can't have a society. And I don't think this is what God has intended for the church. I mean, I don't agree with my wife about everything. I don't agree with my kids about everything. And they don't agree with me. And I may be wrong. I may be right. So I think that's kind of the way that we need to kind of think about these discussions.
Yeah. And that unity doesn't require uniformity. And that is a big distinction, right? That we can still be unified without having that uniformity of thinking.
Yeah. Particularly as Christians in the body of Christ, there are certain things we unite around, right? The truth of the gospel and Christian orthodoxy. But, even when you look at, sorry, my doorbell's ringing.
No, you're
even
good.
when you look at the book of Revelation, kind of the vision of the kingdom of God at the end of the age, every nation, tribe, tongue, people retain their distinctions, their who they are. And really, it's kind of this mosaic of humanity. Like the image of God is a mosaic of different people groups, different people, different tribes. That's what makes it, I think, beautiful. And I think, humility requires us to say, I learned from people who are different than me. I need to be around people who feel passionately about something about which I feel passionately about, but we disagree. It makes my opinion a little bit more solid. I also may change my mind on some things. I may learn some things. And I think that's really important for us. It's a mature thing. This is a kind of spiritual maturity of growing in Christ that we can live this way. So.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, so helpful. And people, you've written a whole book about this. So where can people find your book and what's it called?
Yeah, so it's called Away with Words, Using Our Online Conversations for Good. It's published by B&H Publishing. You can find it at any of your favorite online retailers, Amazon, Lifeway, Barnes & Noble, or independent stores. You can go to my website, awaywithwordsbook.com. We have links to all that. Or you just go to your favorite retailer. But I'd love for folks to pick it up and kind of engage this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really helpful, and we wish you the best with your book.
Well, thank you so much. And I love really the work that you're doing here with this podcast and the conversations you're having. So I just want to wish you well. I think this is the kind of thing that we need more of.
Great. Yeah, thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.